Hello my friends and welcome back to my channel. I like to be very honest with you. I did not expect a very big difference between the PlayStation 5 and PC version in regards of HDR, and I was almost correct because there's literally no difference at all. My name is Markus. Let's talk about HDR. And here we are, but before we start talking about The Last of Us Part 1 on the PC, I'd like to say thank you to a very generous sponsor, Xarflux. That's his username on YouTube, because without him, this video would not happening. Thank you very much again. Thank you very much for sponsoring. And now let's talk about HDR in The Last of Us Part 1 on the PC. A couple of months ago, I think actually 6 months ago, I made already an HDR analyze video to The Last of Us Part 1 for the PlayStation 5. And yeah, everything what I said in this video or in the video back then counts for the PC version as well, because there's literally no difference at all. When we're talking about HDR, no difference at all. We still have no HDR system level calibration support under Windows 11. We still have no HDR black level raise as far as I can tell. I looked very closely, but it is really on a very high level in my opinion, the HDR implementation. We still have no proper HDR settings in the game, and we still have the same maximum peak brightness as on the PlayStation 5, around 10,000 nits maximum peak brightness, which of course is for many TVs, or most of the TVs, just way too much. Not having a HDR system level calibration support in this game or in games in general is usually not a big problem, because in most of the games or many games we have actually proper HDR settings where we can adjust HDR as we need it. But in this case, and that's a problem, we don't have anything at all. Okay, not quite true, but what we have here is HDR on off, contrast, brightness and HUD brightness. So all those settings what you can see here, they are just for changing the picture appearance. They are not meant to increase or decrease the maximum peak brightness in this game, but believe me, you don't want to increase the maximum peak brightness in this game anyway. Because when we're talking about maximum peak brightness in specular highlights, like for an example this one, the sun, and maybe many of you remembering this, that's the very bright object in the sky when you leave the house or when you leave your room. Maybe, yeah, forget about this, just Google it, okay? Anyway, when we're talking about specular highlights like that, we're talking about a maximum peak brightness up to 10,000 nits, exactly the same as on the PlayStation 5. And again, that's even for the newest TVs or the latest TVs like the LG G3, and I can't wait to get this TV. It is just way too much. We need to have brighter TVs. So maybe in 5 years from now, we can enjoy this game in 10,000 nits maximum peak brightness. But for now we can't, and that's the problem, and that's why we have, regardless of what we actually setting up in the brightness menu here, and it really doesn't matter at all, and you shouldn't change too much, but I talk about this menu in a second. We have way too much maximum peak brightness, and that's a problem, because we will have a lot of clipping and specular highlights depending on the tone mapping what you're actually using on your TV. The fact that we have in this game a maximum peak brightness up to 10,000 nits makes it very hard for me to recommend HDR, because in specular highlights like the sun here, you will have a lot of clipping because of the maximum peak brightness. The same counts for dynamic tone mapping on, but it can be a little bit better compared to HDR, depending on the scene, depending on the specular highlight, and also depending on the brightness from the specular highlight. The best option actually to get the most details out of specular highlights is dynamic tone mapping off. The same as the same what I recommended actually back then for the PlayStation 5 version, because 10,000 nits maximum peak brightness, just way too much for the LG G2. And when we're talking about HDR versus dynamic tone mapping on or off, then we need to talk about the average picture brightness as well, because as in many other games, dynamic tone mapping on offers a much higher picture brightness, general picture brightness, than HDR or dynamic tone mapping off. So that's something to consider, because if you're not happy with the brightness in this game, I would actually recommend to try dynamic tone mapping on, but keep in mind in many specular highlights you have even more clipping compared to HDR. So just keep in mind dynamic tone mapping off is my recommendation for this game, then HDR, and then just if you like the higher brightness, use dynamic tone mapping on. And of course we have picture settings, but again please keep in mind those settings are not meant to change the maximum peak brightness in this game. Those settings are really just to change the picture as you like it. So we have of course HDR on off toggle, we have contrast, we have brightness and HUD brightness. I mean HUD brightness, clear, it's HUD brightness, okay? So let's start with contrast, and in my opinion this is a very dangerous setting. Let's say you increase this value way too much, let's say +10, you will lose a lot of fine details in darker areas. Shadow details are completely gone. If you now decrease this value way too much, you will have a washed out picture like this. You will have a lot of shadow details, but I mean this doesn't look good at all. So my recommendation actually in terms of settings, and this depends on the tone mapping mode what you're actually using. So on my LGCX or the G2 I found when I'm using HDR or dynamic tone mapping off, a value -1 or -2, maximum -2 was fine. I actually tend more to -1 with HDR and dynamic tone mapping off. On the other hand, if you use dynamic tone mapping on, I will not touch this, because then contrast in my opinion is almost spot on. Let's move on to brightness, and what I found in terms of brightness, do not reduce this because the game is already a little bit dark, so you will lose a lot of average picture brightness. So brightness setting is actually not very helpful when it comes to shadow details. A little bit helpful, but not very much. So this is really just increasing the average picture brightness, and I didn't find any problem or major problem doing that. Okay, so what you need to keep in mind is that when we're talking about clipping in specular highlights, that's because of we having a lot of or a very high peak brightness. So when you increase this even further, like +10, you will have even more clipping in specular highlights, but also you gain more brightness on the screen. So in terms of settings for HDR dynamic tone mapping off, I found actually a value between 0 and 5 was actually not bad. Dynamic tone mapping on, as always, leave it as 0, because dynamic tone mapping on with the standard settings, I found it actually not too bad. So let's just quickly talk about black level rays, elevated black levels in The Last of Us Part 1 on the PC, and that's something where we should start on the PC, on my PC. So first of all, I haven't changed anything in terms of the RGB range from my GPU. It's set to auto, which means it's full. TV is also set to auto, which means we are not changing anything. So output is RGB full, we are receiving RGB full, we are not changing anything, okay? In terms of HDR black level rays, elevated black levels, I couldn't be happier. And by the way, if you see some flickering, that's because of VRR. And here it's actually a little bit noticeable even in person, okay? Usually the camera makes this much worse, okay? So keep this in mind, okay? If you see a lot of flickering, that's also because of the camera. But back to elevated black levels, I haven't changed my brightness setting on the TV. It's still 50. I haven't touched the fine-tune dark area settings. It's still set to 0. That's what you get out of the box, and that's actually a great result. I'm happy. Contrast is on a great level, same as, let's say like this, Uncharted on the PC. It's also on a very great level, and with similar issues like way too much peak brightness in the game. But again, contrast is actually way more important than to have very fine details in specular highlights. And again, this is on a very good level. Okay, my friends, so that's it for this video. I say thank you very much for watching me, and as always, please don't forget to share, like and subscribe. And let me know in the comment section what you think about this game. I enjoyed it so far, the testing on the PC, but I have to say I had also some crashes on the PC, so it was not quite stable as I would hoped for, but that's how it is. I can't change it. PlayStation 5 version back then was without any issues at all. PC, as always, there is a little bit of a problem in the very beginning, but I'm very sure this will be fixed soon. So let me know what you think about the game. Let me know how do you like HDR in this game. And yeah, thank you very much again. I see you guys next time. Bye.